Good evening and welcome. My name is Edouard Kopp. I'm the John Eyre Eckel Junior Foundation Chief Curator of the Menil Drawing Institute, and it's my pleasure to welcome you this evening for a talk on cataloguing Robert Motherwell's drawings. And I'm pleased to be joined by Katy Rogers, who's Program Director and Director of the Robert Motherwell Catalogue Raisonné project, and also Joseph Newland, who is Director of Publishing here at the Menil collection. So this program is organized in conjunction with the opening at the Drawing Institute of the exhibition Robert Motherwell Drawing, As Fast as the Man Itself, which opened today, as a matter of fact, and which will be on view until March the 12th, 2023. And the exhibition is the most comprehensive in decades on this rich and fascinating topic. And we've been fortunate to get amazing loans from 22 lenders, both institutions and private lenders. It is organized with the support of the Dedalus Foundation, the foundation established by Robert Motherwell towards the end of his life. And the exhibition really is meant to coincide with the publication of a landmark book, the Motherwell Catalogue Raisonné of Drawings, which has been authored by Katy. And it's a great scholarly achievement, which no doubt will widen the understanding of Motherwell's drawings, which, as many of you will know, has been long first and foremost known as a painter. And yet the book really makes a case for the centrality of drawing in his practice over the decades of his career. Also, it's a beautiful object. It's really thoughtfully designed and beautifully printed with the highest caliber of illustrations. And copies of the Catalogue Raisonné, as well as the book that accompanies the exhibition are on sale on the table over there with our colleague Paul Forsyth from the Menil bookstore. And so after the talk, you're welcome to buy copies or at a later date if you wish. As always, the Menil programs are free and open to all, and all our programs are available on our website. So please go and check what we have coming up. And before we get started, some practical details. Please turn off your cell phones if you haven't done that already, or silence them. The conversation will be about 45 minutes, and then we'll open for questions. So please keep your questions until the end, and we'll be happy to answer them. And finally, the program is recorded. It will be made accessible on YouTube in the coming days. So now I'd like to introduce our two participants tonight. So first, Katy Rogers, so again, Programs Director and Director of the Catalogue Raisonné project at the Dedalus Foundation. So she's the author of this catalogue, but also she was, in 2012, a co-author of the Catalogue Raisonné of Motherwell's paintings and collages. And she's published and lectured widely on issues related to catalogue raisonnés, artist-endowed foundations, and Motherwell. And her work has appeared most recently in the Archives of American Art Journal, Art Libraries Journal, and Gagosian Quarterly. And she serves on the board of the Dedalus Foundation and the College Art Association. Now, Joseph Newland. He has been the esteemed Director of Publishing here at the Menil for 10 years this week, he mentioned, and he has worked on 22 books and online publications in that capacity. But he has done many, many more in his long career, which started in 1979, publishing career. And his career has included producing the Menil's 6th volume of the Jasper Johns Catalogue Raisonné of Drawing, but also stints at museums in Seattle, Los Angeles, New York, and freelancing for about 20 museums in the US, the UK, and Japan. And during his gap year before grad school, and in the first year after, Joseph worked in 2 different art galleries with deep inventories of Robert Motherwell's prints, seeding a love of the artist's works on paper that culminates in drawing as fast as the mind itself. So we're so lucky to have them tonight, and together we're going to discuss the making of this great book. And of course, we're going to hear a lot from the author, from Katy, how she, about her experience of making this project, how she organized this massive amount of research and information, and how she organized the publishing project. But also we'd love to hear about the challenges that she faced, both expected and less expected, and also what editorial decisions you had to make as you went along. And I know we're going to hear about some of the discoveries you made during the research phase of the catalogue. And finally, we'll talk more about the making of a book and the artful science of printing. And I know Joseph has a lot of experience in that field as well. And really, having Joseph is a way to add perspective to the discussion. Thanks to your deep experience in publishing, but also your recent involvement with the Jasper Jones catalogue raisonné. So first, Katy, I wanted to ask you a simple question. What is the Dedalus Foundation, and what was it established for?
Thank you. It's so nice to be here with everyone. Thank you for coming tonight, and thank you to Edouard and Joseph, and to everyone here at the Menil. It's such a beautiful exhibition, and it's such a pleasure for me to share this research, but also the artworks with you all. The Dedalus Foundation was created first by Robert Motherwell in 1981. He'd first called it the Motherwell Foundation, and he thought about it as a legacy program, but also he thought a lot about modernism, and we'll talk more about the importance of modernism to him. So over the next 10 years, Motherwell was very aware of the importance of art history and in our own records of artists and their words and their works. And so Motherwell, towards the end of his life, just a week before he passed, changed the name to the Dedalus Foundation. And I always bring this up because I think it's important to underscore Motherwell's perspective. Dedalus is named after, Stephen Dedalus, who appears in James Joyce's Ulysses and Portrait of the Artist as a young man. And this underscores Motherwell's interest in our supporting modern art and modernist principles and the public appreciation thereof. And I think it's very unique for an artist to do that, where we have our legacy component, but he's thinking actively about scholarship and about conversation and about access. And so that is something that is in keeping with his entire life.
So while he was alive, did he ask his foundation to do a catalogue raisonné? Was it part of the mission?
It was. I think for a living artist, a catalogue raisonné is very complicated. It, in some ways, I think Joseph could speak more to this. In some ways, it is confronting your own mortality. This is your legacy. Many artists express, as Motherwell did, when you have a retrospective and you're forced by a curator to go through your entire life. Most of us don't have to do that. Frank O'Hara, who curated his retrospective at the Museum of Modern Art in 1965, wrote a beautiful essay about Motherwell and the fact that, we don't ask anyone else to put up their entire life's accomplishments on a wall and have people walk by them in just a few minutes. And so for Motherwell, he understood, though, the difficulties and the need of cataloging and presenting work together. So he had, as early as the early 80s, he started a print catalogue raisonné, and there were several editions during his life and one posthumous. Motherwell also, there's correspondence that he was interested in doing a catalogue raisonné specifically of the elegies. They started reaching out, his studio started reaching out, but that never came to fruition. So he was definitely aware of it, although he did not stipulate it in his will.
And before we go any further, it would be quite useful to remind everyone what a catalogue raisonné does and what this kind of publication matters. If you could just remind us of that.
Of course. So a catalogue raisonné is a very unique kind of project. Unlike anything else, unlike a retrospective, unlike collected works, it should include everything. But each catalogue raisonné is entirely unique. It's dependent on the artist. For Motherwell himself, we split it up, so we have the prints, but we also have the paintings, the collages, and the paintings on paper, and we'll probably talk a little bit more about that, and then we have the drawings. So in each of those, it should be all of the known works in those media. Some artists choose to do it by just chronologically, and they do all the works in a particular period of years, but for us, medium was the determining factor. So a catalogue raisonné is meant, in my mind, my opinion, is meant to be the culmination of intense research into provenance, exhibition history, bibliographic history, and also the artworks themselves. So a catalogue raisonné should see as many works as possible, to catalog them fully, to unframe them, if people will let you. That's a little harder with drawings. To measure them properly, to identify their media properly, to look at signatures, and then their full history. And that should be placed together, usually in a chronological order, but sometimes people do things differently. It's all chronological in our catalogues raisonné. And those objects are meant to be used by a broad variety of audiences. So when someone would ask me who my audience is for this, I'm hoping it's students. I'm hoping it's artists. I'm also hoping it's aficionados, people who love Motherwell, but also people who've never experienced him. It's a way for people to look at all of the work together and learn from it. And my hope is that it's a springboard for further engagement and scholarship. Of course, the other aspect of it is it does support the market. So it supports the market by essentially presenting the known authentic corpus of works. So dealers use it, museums use it to make sure the provenance of their works, and auction houses use it. A certain amount of my responsibility is to support sales through auction houses by providing research and letting them know if there's any issue with the artwork. And then, of course, curators use it to hopefully put together beautiful exhibitions like this one.
That's very much the case. We could not have done this exhibition without an early access to the catalogue raisonné, so we're extremely grateful. I was hoping we could talk a little bit about which sources of information did you use, to really arrive at this result.
So on the screen, you'll see the checklist from Motherwell's first solo exhibition at Peggy Guggenheim's Art of This Century Gallery in 1944. And you'll see the vast majority of the works on this checklist are drawings. Oh, I love this thing. Here's our colored drawings, and he breaks them into colored drawings and just drawings here.
And some are in the exhibition.
Some are in the exhibition.
Yeah.
Some of them were shown here for the last time in 1944, and this is the second time they're being shown. So we worked with archives. We work with Motherwell's archive. Motherwell left us all of his professional and personal papers, 30,000 images. I also rely on, this is another great one of Motherwell in his studio in 1945 in Greenwich Village. So there are drawings here on the wall, including, I think, one that's here in the show. Right? This is one of our...
And sometimes it's a photograph may be the only trace of a drawing, because a number of works are lost, right?
A number of works are lost. And we'll see a couple a little bit later in the slideshow of works that are only known from photographs. So I work with other artists' archives. I work with private collectors. I work with galleries. I work with auction houses and curators. Spent a lot of time visiting with folks who knew Motherwell, so interviewing people who knew him, gathering as many perspectives as possible, and realizing that there may be surprises. I may find an artwork because it's in Architectural Digest in a design feature. It's also convincing people that a catalogue raisonné is important, and it's important that their work be seen in it and be seen well. Because many people that I would write would say, but I don't want to loan my work to an exhibition. So there's a lot of education in that too.
And I was wondering whether you could tell us a little bit about, in your view, what constitutes a drawing for Motherwell. And I have my own view, but as the author of the Catalogue raisonné, you had to think about his own conception of drawing, his own practice, but also find a kind of rational way to break up your work and the different volumes, right? So I was hoping if you could tell us a bit about how this was done.
Absolutely. So we struggled with this. With an artist like Motherwell, all told, we're looking at about 5,000 objects between his drawings, his paintings, his collages, his paintings on paper, and his prints. And he had a hard time defining what drawing was. And he tried to write about it, but he had... I follow his train of thought through interviews and published articles, and it changes over time, as it should. I mean, I think there's something really, really significant about Motherwell and his approach is that he wasn't static. You can see it in the diversity of his images, but also in the way he uses drawing. So there are some works here, the open drawings that you have here in the last gallery, where it's just a simple charcoal line. And there are paintings that we define as paintings, where it's just the simple charcoal line on a painted ground. But for Motherwell, it often has to do with, partially with scale, and also medium. So what we decided, after we struggled with, is a drawing something that doesn't use a brush? Is a painting with a brush? I mean, the things that you talk about when you're working on a catalogue raisonné, what a bracket means, what a brace means, what a paintbrush strip means, is do we have to put the medium of the signature? It sometimes makes you a little crazy. It makes you feel like you're maybe the only person in the world who cares about it. But then you meet people who share with you them using your catalogue raisonné. So I very much appreciate that. Because it can be a very lonely work too, because you're in it thinking, this is a drawing because I say it's a drawing. But so what we decided to do is works on paper, but not in paint media. So if it's acrylic, oil, or shellac, Motherwell sometimes used, those were in the paintings on paper. And we felt like the gesture and intent behind them was different than works done in ink or other graphic media. So you can see from Motherwell's studio here, everything was kind of mixed in together. And this is what I mean. He also would sometimes catalog something as a drawing, and then he would change it to a painting, or something that would be paint on paper this one would be a drawing, but that one would be a painting. But it wasn't his responsibility necessarily to define those things. I consider that my responsibility. His responsibility was to make them. So I love this picture of the studio as well, where you can kind of get a sense for the interplay between the different works, but also, he has pictures by other artists on his wall, and even some portraits of friends who were presences in his life and his work.
And there's a great photograph here, and we apologize for the slight pixelation of the image, but if you could tell us about when this picture was taken, because it has some local relevance.
It does. So for Motherwell, I mean, with many artists, and this frustrated Motherwell as well as I think a lot of artists, the market devalues drawings and small works on paper. They're not considered as valuable as larger paintings. And in the late 70s, Motherwell was talking to a Houston dealer, Janie C. Lee, about having an exhibition. And they settled on doing a drawings exhibition for that reason, that she felt like the drawings deserved more recognition. So this is a shot of his studio wall in May 1979, and it shows a selection of drawings that he was showing with Janie. She came by. I have some wonderful correspondence where they talk about this wall and their selections, and they decided at that time to make it a retrospective, and they hired a young art historian that Motherwell had just become close with, named Jack Flam, who's now the president of our foundation, and he wrote the catalog. And that's really the last retrospective of Motherwell's drawings in 1979 here in Houston.
So it sounds like Houston is a center for Motherwell.
I think so.
Motherwell works.
Mm-hmm. This is just another nice image of Motherwell hanging a wall in his retrospective at the Guggenheim in the 80s with a curator. And I like this sense where he wanted to share the relationship between the artists. And he was very cognizant of that, the artworks. He was very cognizant of that.
What I love is the asymmetric, slightly, very creative way with which he displays his drawings. I tried to do that a little bit in the exhibition, but I felt I was not Robert Motherwell, and so we went for something a little more balanced. One thing I wanted to ask you is like a practical aspect. How did you organize the mass of information which you inevitably had to share with colleagues, right? Mm-hmm. So I don't know if you could tell us a little bit about how this practical aspect happened.
Absolutely. So this is a screenshot of our database. We work with a FileMaker database system. There are many cataloging databases. Partly we picked this because it is very flexible and allows a lot of opportunity to customize. So this is a work from the Joyce sketchbook. There are 8 of these in the exhibition. So you can kind of see each of those tabs up at the top are individual related databases. So each work has its general cataloging, and then its exhibitions, its literature, its provenance, a variety of images. So we scan installation shots, archival images, conservation images, verso images, close-ups of signatures, and all of that it comes in handy to support exhibitions. You'll see down at the bottom in the middle column, it says this work is on loan to the Menil collection.
It's still here.
It's still here. I hope so.
So now I'd like to turn the conversation towards the making of the book. So transitioning from the database to this beautiful object. But before I do that, I have a simple question. Other institutions go for online catalog raisonnés because they actually admit that a catalog raisonné is never finished in a way. Unless the work of a particular artist is limited or very stable. So what was your rationale?
I think that is a great point. If I did not have a book, I would probably work on this until they put me in the ground. You can't, it's very hard to let go unless you have a deadline. We're all human, right? But with a catalog raisonné, especially with an artist as rich as Motherwell, you just find more and more things. And drawings are particularly difficult because artists tend to give them away, they tend to trade them. Things leave the studio in other ways, and things get lost over time, partly because they're smaller, they're portable, and they're less valuable, so they're not always linked. But we decided on a print catalog raisonné partly because Robert Motherwell loved books, and so do I. And I have the pleasure of sitting up here with other people who love books, and I assume you do too, but they are a static point in time. We're all referring to the same information when a work comes up for sale. So that's an appealing part of it. You also have control over the way the images are presented. You have control over the design. And something that I also like about books is this book will still be here long after we're gone. Online publishing is not in its infancy anymore. It's becoming more sophisticated. I like the aspect of access. I like the aspect of, the fact that you can continue to update it. You can show more images. There are many nice things about online, but I also think that we don't know what the internet will look like in 50 years. We don't know who is going to be responsible for updating that or preserving that. I know some major archives, what they do when they receive a database is they print it all out and make PDFs of it, and that's what they preserve because they can't run those customized systems and they can't dedicate a special workstation for that. So this actually felt more stable and provided the kind of access that we wanted.
And it can't be hacked.
It can't be hacked, I know.
And Joseph, I wondered if you had any thoughts on this, which is a lively debate, right, in the catalogue raisonné community.
Well, I mean, it is a point in time, and there are also the possibility of updating things. I remember when I was in grad school and I saw the 5th edition of the Velázquez Catalogue raisonné by the same person. So that's when I learned that catalogues raisonné could be very fluid. Or maybe he just couldn't make up his mind, I don't know. But where something like this, where you've got much more resources and you've got a continuous lineage of sources, I think that makes it easier. But I do feel like the other thing is you don't know what people are seeing when they look at a screen. How many people, if you have a color-corrected screen, does anybody here have a program that they actually color see? I mean, I look very different in my Zoom calls on my laptop and my desktop. So I know that Robert Motherwell does too. You know, so I mean, who knows what that pink is? Who knows what that gray is? So I think that's one of the things. Is we've been printing books for a long time, and you have the ability to do much more nuance and control it. I will actually address that in one particular kind of case at the end. But I do feel that that's something that is still the state of the art of reproduction is in printing right now, and so I think it'll continue that way for a while, and there is the software issue. I mean, how many of you have diskettes? Much less the big floppies. You know, I mean that's gone. And reverse engineering of software. I think that there's no standard for catalogues raisonné, and they're proprietary systems who are actually competing with each other. And that's another reason not to do it until there are standards established. Yeah, I mean, Rebecca and I have talked about this. The Cezanne Catalogue raisonné is online and it's free. That's a good way to do it. Everything else is subscription. So, but it's a great research tool too. So everything has its pros and cons.
Mm-hmm. And if I understand correctly, the earlier volumes of the Motherwell Catalogue raisonné are accessible online as PDF, right?
They are accessible through Yale University Press, who publish both editions. They're starting something new called the Art and Architecture Portal, which is a subscription service. It's mostly for schools, but where they take the content and they take all the design out of it. But you're able to search across a variety of books. So you could say, look up this Motherwell collage, and you could see any of the books that are on their platform. It's mainly meant for students, but anyone can subscribe to it.
I'd like to turn for a minute about the sort of collaborative nature of the making of a catalogue raisonné, and if you could tell us a little bit about, because you are the author, you directed the project, but you work with a number of people on this.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So my name is on the cover, but there are lots of names inside. Anything like this is always a team effort. No one. I would hope very few would have the hubris to think they could do it themselves, because you rely not only on your internal team, but so many other people in the world to give generously of their time and information. This is a nice picture that we took at MoMA this year when we were color proofing the catalogue raisonné. So this person in front, it was our color specialist. Her name is Kerrigan Kessler, and you'll see her with a Pantone book, matching that to give information to the printer, to Joseph's point. And then the person in the back is Sarah Henry, who's the production manager from Yale University Press, who was responsible for all of our production.
Wait a minute, just 1 second. Look in the very foreground. There's a cropped drawing that's going to appear later. It appears in this book, and it'll appear later in the presentation as well. So there it is at MoMA being color-proofed.
Mm-hmm.
And it's next door as well.
And it's next door. And here we are on press. So we included this because being on press is a sort of magical experience that not all of us get to have. So it's myself, our Sarah Henry from Yale, and then Massimo Tonoli, who is the magician and artisan at Trifolio Press in Verona, and he printed the Catalogue raisonné as well as the Menil exhibition catalog. So this is us looking under very controlled circumstances over some of the hot-off-the-press proofs, and they can change anything. I mean, it's like magic to be on there. It's a UV press, so when they come off, they're exactly the color they're going to stay, and they can take out 5% of yellow. It's a CMYK process, but Joseph will talk a little bit about a special fifth color we added. But you can see us comparing two sets of proofs, and they would run, I don't know, sometimes 10 different ones where I would say a little more black there, a little more yellow there, and it's really magical to see.
So let's flick through some of the pages, and you've selected some pages that really present real discoveries that you've made. So if you wanted to...
there are a couple of these works in the exhibition. These are from the Triple V portfolio from 1942. So this is Motherwell's first real series in any media. So he made these for a portfolio to support a surrealist magazine called Triple V, of which he was the editor at that time. And you can see the other artists here, Breton, Calder, Carrington, Chagall, and so on. So I included this one because it's really interesting. The brown paper, the portfolio itself it's about this big, and they're loose inside of it. In Motherwell's works, which he chose to draw individual drawings instead of prints like most of the other artists, they were too small, so he had to put them on these little brown sheets. And many of them have been cut out of the sheet, so we don't always know their specific orientation. This is the only one I know that is horizontal. So it's really interesting. It's the need to see the object itself. This is in the collection of a foundation that their artist had this from the 40s. And so to be able to show that in its context here, we also don't know how many of these were made. There are about 20 of them, but Motherwell himself at some point, the Triple V says, we were going to make 100, we were going to make 50, and no one actually knows how many there are. The work is never done. And then this is the Mexican sketchbook, which is amazingly here in the show. This is another example where I wanted to show these comparative figures. In the 2012 Catalogue raisonné, we chose to be kind of just the facts. We don't editorialize, and I try not to editorialize here either, because that's not the role of a Catalogue raisonné. It's for you to take away from our research what you want to take away and to interpret it. But I wanted to show more here, and the designer worked with me to find ways. Here is the front and back cover of the book, as well as some of his notes on the inside. And I found this really fascinating because the sketchbook is still intact. It's one of the few, and it itself is an object. This is his first real mature work. And you can see that it's all encompassing. He goes so far as to paint the covers and to use it as this way to work through all of these problems. He, as a young artist who just decided to dedicate himself to his work, it's all there. And so we wanted to put that here because until I saw this in person, I did not know. And what it was the art handler at MoMA said, "Hey, did you look at the back?" And because he had loved it and found it so interesting. And Edouard had asked about any interesting inscriptions. So a lot of Motherwell works are not signed on the back, although there was a strange code on the back of some of the early drawings that I couldn't figure out, a 4-number code. And eventually I figured out it was just the number of the frame he wanted to frame these things in. I thought it was a mystery, but it wasn't a mystery. You never know. I mean, you want to find discoveries. That's what you're hoping for. But this is a work that's at the Art Gallery of Ontario, which has the large work, which has one of the largest collections of drawings in the world, many of which are here. And I reproduce the backing board here. And Motherwell draws, the work is called Capriccio, and he draws another little figure on the back. And we don't consider this a drawing. We chose not to include ephemera or things. He would sometimes, to his wife, draw little drawings and things for her birthday. But this is one that I felt was really interesting in terms of, his own context and what he left on the work itself.
In this case, you made an interesting layout decision about adding the artist's materials.
It's true. So the lyric suite, of which there are many examples, is a very interesting and complex series. It's about a third of the drawings that are in here. There are 555 of them. And they were all made with calligraphy inks for the most part, and on Riu paper, which is made out of mulberry. So I wanted to include these because this particular series is so dependent on medium, and we did inherit some of his studio archives. Not everything. I mean, he had an enormous 7-studio complex at the end of his life, but they did preserve these inks. And I think having that materiality here is really important. We were going to talk a little bit about the lyric suite because it's so important. This is Motherwell with the curator Frank O'Hara, who also appears elsewhere in the exhibition and in the drawing Joseph mentioned. I love this picture. This is 1965, the art world. There's lots of alcohol, always smoking. Motherwell was almost never without a cigarette. And so Frank O'Hara was working with Motherwell on a retrospective at MoMA, 1965. Motherwell's 50. He's one of the few living artists to be given that honor. It's a lot of pressure, as we talked about that thing that we put on to artists that Frank talked about. So they're talking a lot about his early work, and he's having a painting block. And he buys 1,000 sheets of this beautiful mulberry paper, which I recommend going and taking a look at. Each sheet is unique, and you have the fibers in it. And one day, Motherwell says it struck him, I paint the 1,000 sheets. Don't stop. It's just the ink and white paper. And he went back to psychic automatism. And he was also at that time spending a lot of time with the artist David Smith, who was a very close friend of both Motherwell and his wife at the time, Helen Frankenthaler. And Motherwell says, that he was so inspired by Smith and Frankenthaler's just artistic fecundity. They were just incredibly versatile and prolific artists, and they were also important people in his life. So Motherwell's making these drawings in the end of April into early May, and he spends a couple of weeks, and he's just every day making dozens of them. And then on May 23rd, 1965, David Smith dies in a car accident. And maybe we can show the next slide. This is Motherwell's date book from that period. And you'll see, he led a very busy and sometimes chaotic life, especially during his marriage to Frankenthaler. They were very social. They were really at the center of the New York art world. But you can see Motherwell scratches everything out during this week, and it just says RMM Frank. And it's just Motherwell and Frank spending time processing David Smith's death. You can see Lake George up there, which is where Smith's home and studio was. David Smith. And so Motherwell never made another lyric suite. But at that time, he didn't call them the lyric suite. And this is another example of how we put together our research. So we have these date books. And over here, upside down, you can see Motherwell's hand, and he writes gesture number or cadenza number. And this is when he's thinking of what to call this series. And Frank O'Hara is helping him understand how to conceive of it, how to title it, but also how to arrange it. They're in the studio trying to figure out what's going on with these 555 things that they have to put away. Eventually, a couple weeks later, Motherwell settles on Lyric Suite after Albenberg, so staying within that music. And at one point, he thought to finish the 1,000. He has like a gesture 1 to 1,000 somewhere else. So another choice that we talked about, the Lyric Suite are very unique because we have them, those are the only works in either catalog where it's just the images and there's no words on the page. And we'll show some of that. And part of that is here you see the lyric suite on Motherwell's studio wall and how he hung them together always as a group. And you also see it here. He gave a gift of works to MoMA in 1987. So here you see that, and you also see over here the way they displayed the Mexican sketchbook.
Unbound.
Yeah. No, those are reproductions.
Okay. So
Yeah. No, they didn't.
Thank God.
No, it's reproduction. So all of this informed
yeah.
the layout here. So we wanted to have the work grouped together so you could see them as a series, because he always thought of them as a series. In 66 and 67, he gave several groups to the Metropolitan Museum, MoMA, in honor of Frank O'Hara, who passed away tragically in 1966, and to San Francisco, what's now San Francisco MoMA. And the first gift was to the Met, and they all look the same. They're all the same splash with blue lines underneath. So he gave 12 at the time, later 24, but they didn't actually accession them until many decades later because of the catalogue raisonné, but they were on site and stored safely. And he then gave to MoMA a wide variety. So, some of the earliest ones have, lyric suite, red and blue #1 and things like that. But he gave that up very quickly. I think no one wanted to title 555 of them. And then he started to think of them as a mixed group. So that's what we did here. And an artist looked at this with me and she said, what I like about it is it's like the drawings resist. You're just sort of glancing over them. Purely automatic works, and abstract works. Sometimes, people don't spend a lot of time with them, but here it sort of is, it is a way for you to rest your eye and be forced to look at each one. Okay. The work on, the large work is here in the show. And so I like this spread partly because, this work was missing since 1944. And I worked with a curator because I had a hunch that she had worked with a collector that had another work in their collection. And I wrote her and I said, could you ask them? And indeed, they had this work that had never been seen. I only knew its title, The Redness of Red, from that early checklist. And she was able to get it for me. And it's really that sense of community around research. And many folks in the art field understand the importance of catalog raisonné, so they're willing to, throw their weight behind it. And something I like about this spread as well is this one in black and white. This is a work that I haven't found. Here it is, hanging on his bedroom wall. That's the bed. And so we include those so that when it shows up, we will have a home for it. And this is another work where it's normally overmatted, just over this part, but we included the full sheet here so that you can see Motherwell's working process on it. Here's the Joyce sketchbook. There are works here in the exhibition. Here's another one where I was able to put the Motherwell illustrated. He did not like the word illustrate. He does not illustrate Joyce. He made drawings related to Ulysses. Here, a beautiful, beautiful book. It's about that thick of Ulysses. So the drawing here, there's a lot of variance on this sort of form, this vertical form with sort of 2 steps down. And, it looked like a building to me, but I wasn't sure what it was. So in reading, Motherwell talks about amassing a library about Ireland because he felt like Ulysses was about many things, but it was also about Ireland. And he writes to the publisher of this book, and he says, I've been reading all this stuff about Ireland. And so here's another work that's here in the show. Another example. And so in his library, which we have, his studio library, there's a book about Ireland, and here's this picture. So I'm just flipping through, and oh, shock of recognition. Motherwell himself talks about the importance of after image. This is an image of St. Kevin's Cathedral in Glendalough. And you see that tower and those sort of steps down. And Motherwell would have seen that. And Motherwell would have loved the story of St. Kevin because it also shows up in Joyce's Finnegan's Wake, kind of reconfigured. St. Kevin was a saint who was apparently so attractive that he had to go and live by a hermit, and he had to go as far away as possible because women kept throwing themselves at him to the extent where he had to drown one of them, which I think Joyce found very amusing, and by extension, so did Motherwell.
So you also found a number of very early drawings, and here I wanted to ask you, the first object that you catalogue is from 1941, the Mexican sketchbook. He's 26 years old, but we know he draws for decades before that. So what made you decide that this was the right moment to start? Because other catalogue raisonnés include what is referred to as juvenilia.
That's right. We struggled with this one as well. So Motherwell himself talks about drawing from childhood, but he also is very distinct that his life as a mature artist, when he believes he is an artist, starts with a trip to Mexico in the Mexican sketchbook in summer of 1941. So we did find some of these things, including this little drawing. And these were included in the 2012 Catalogue Raisonné under a Juvenilia section. But I continued to look at them because I was interested in how this relates to his work early on. So this is a sort of funny little drawing, very much inspired by Dufy. Motherwell talks about, he spent some time in Paris in 38, 39 and came back home because of the war. And he talks about drawing and painting things from postcards. He lived in Oregon and taught at the university there for a year afterward. And he brought back a bunch of postcards. And so I thought, okay, I'm going to see if I can find any of these postcards. And in fact, the wonders of eBay, this is a postcard. And if you look here, we've got the shadow on the trees. And you've got it here in Motherwell's interpretation as well. So this was a postcard. I don't have his original, but I believe it's one that he would have had. It's from the period.
And then another discovery. These are two works at the Art Gallery of Ontario. Therefore, he was illustrating Marianne Moore's translation of Fontaine's Fables. And these two, we were looking at them in person, and they were next to each other, and we moved them, and they're a perfect fit. You can see here the line here where they're cut, and they put them here. So those are two separate, and where he cut them on here. And I find that very interesting because this is the 40s, and he's kind of trying to save on materials and things, but he's so not cautious, then he just cuts off part of the drawing. So that was kind of fun. And you found some oddities sometimes, right?
I did. I saw this one in a collector's home, and I thought, what is this? It was like nothing else. It's not, that form doesn't quite, it sometimes shows up in some of his drawings of the burning bush that he did for a synagogue mural, but it felt very different. And I had another moment where in our archival research, I came across an exhibition brochure. And here it is as a design in this exhibition brochure for Samuel Coote's gallery. And so, here's our little Motherwell and the list of artists here. And they even did the drawn line and everything. Here's our Hoffman, the Coote's gallery. Here's our Baziotis. And here is our Gottlieb. And Sam Coote somehow convinced them to write text over their drawings.
And here you've made quite a discovery in this case.
This is another one where I never thought I would find this drawing. So this is Motherwell sitting in the foreground with his second wife sitting in the back, leading young abstractionist, and his wife live in a modern house in East Hampton in a design magazine from August of 1952. He looks very happy here. But, it's very interesting. He lived in a Quonset hut house designed by Pierre Chareau, which was the only building Chareau built outside of France when he lived here, and they were very close friends. So we had this image, and I thought this would be what would be in the catalog raisonné. I did already. We'll just have this odd picture of Motherwell. But then through our research and talking to dealers, someone called me, and the work itself is in Europe, and we were able to locate it and photograph it. So we knew that it was his. We don't know too much else about it, but it was a very exciting discovery.
And then you talked about the importance of archives, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not just your own archives, but going around and thinking laterally.
Mm-hmm. And so this picture, I was talking with a few of you last night about Ken Tyler, the printmaker. This is Motherwell Drawing in Ken Tyler's studio with this long bamboo pen. And it's actually the drawing that we saw in the previous slide. And so Ken Tyler's photographic archives, which are in Australia, helped me identify when he made it and where he made it, and why it's so different than the rest of his works. It's a very large drawing. This is a drawing that's in the catalogue raisonné, and I couldn't quite figure out what these circles were. Someone talked about them. They look a little like amoeba. And so looking at his date books, which I showed you before, we have a specific date here. And then this drawing looks a bit like some other things from the mid-70s. And I realized that what this was, it was a day that he met with the curator, E.A. Carmine, who had been a curator here in Texas, and he curated a show of Motherwell's collages in 1972. But he was then the curator at the National Gallery, and they were talking about Motherwell doing a mural. So this is from one of their meetings where they were talking about what kind of mural it would be. And what those little circles are is the Alexander Calder mobile that is hanging in front of the painting. So you can see Motherwell here in the background, and then the Calder in front. So he was trying to conceive of the painting with the Calder in front of it and how it would look from different angles. Many of the early drawings have very bright colors. There's a few here, but many of them have faded over time because that is what those not color fast brilliant inks do. These works were purchased by a French art dealer named Jean Boucher, who came to the States to look for new artists in 1946. And Sam Coutts introduced her to a bunch of artists. She bought a number of Motherwell works, went back to Paris, and promptly died. These works were put in a portfolio and were not seen until the catalogue raisonné reached out to her heirs in the early 2000s. So they're perfectly preserved. So those are a nice example of how we're able to understand his work better through this research. Okay. Another early thing, I get really excited about my examples. This is one where he talks about one of his earliest influences was a rouleau drawing that he bought at a flea market in Paris, and I could not find it. We did not inherit the works from his collection that were not his, that were by other artists. But in multiple interviews, as late as the late 80s, he talks about it. He says, oh yeah, that rouleau that's in my bedroom. And Architectural Digest comes to my rescue again. A photographer came in the early 80s, and here it is. It's sitting across from his bed in his bedroom. He bought it in 1939, and this is in like 1985, and he kept it there. It was the first thing he saw every morning. So we were really excited because we never thought we'd find it. I won't talk too much about this, but part of a catalog raisonné is building connoisseurship and your eye and your understanding in your database to understand what is and is not by the artist. So that comes from provenance research, from archival research, from working with conservators, and from all the things that go into a catalog raisonné. And some of you may have heard of, a scandal with the Nodler Gallery, which included some works by Robert Motherwell. So this picture is the reverse of a Motherwell painting that was linked to that particular collection, where it was stamped by our catalog raisonné. We do not normally stamp them, but we do continue to have a process by which people can submit works to the catalog raisonné even when it's closed. We feel like that's an important part of our work as the stewards of Motherwell's legacy, that it's important that what's in the market is actually by the artist. For these particular works, if they had been left unchecked, it would have completely misconstrued how he was working in the mid-50s. So we are one of the few foundations that still give opinions. It's not an authentication, as our lawyer will say. It's true, it's whether or not it would be in the catalog raisonné, or if we have to do more research, or if we, but we do look at twice a year. And if a new work comes to light, a previously undocumented work, we have a hybrid approach. So we can look at the next slide. We do an online supplement. Here's the Robert Motherwell drawings, which is released this month, and I already have 2 drawings that have shown up since we closed the catalog raisonné in 2020. So it takes about 2 years of production for this. One of these works showed up at auction, and one of them showed up in the air of a studio assistant. So they went through the whole submission process, and they are now in the supplement.
Thank you. And I had a question for Joseph, because Joseph, we work with the same printer as they did, and you also had to work on our book, so you also had to deal with the reproduction, illustration of Motherwell images. And if you could tell us a little bit about your experience. Well,
one of the things you do is when you're on press, you try to get the best reproduction you can get at the time. And one of the reasons I said, look at that MoMA drawing, was this is a very famous drawing. It's called, it's actually untitled, but it's for a book that Bill Berkson did in honor of Frank O'Hara after he died, called In Memory of My Feelings. And it's been reproduced a lot. It's ink on acetate. And I've seen this drawing reproduced in the original book and the reprint of that book. Obviously, when you're seeking things that you haven't seen, you hope someone else has seen them, or you hope you have a good standard. So here I am in the same press room at the same table that Katy and Sarah and Massimo stood about 2 months before. It was much hotter in late July. And here we are looking at a proof. In Massimo's left hand, you can actually see that is that is actually a printed reproduction from the catalog raisonné that is on file. And there is the man who printed it about 2 months before, making sure that the two match up. So I see Jan Baran in the audience. Massimo and I have spent some time downstairs looking at Twombly drawings and doing the same thing with the Pantone books. Oh, it's between these two colors and so forth. So that's how you get it to be as close as you can. So you hope that this is sort of like an initiatory lineage. You got something that really is right, and then you do it again. But you can't always trust other books. So you have to know that they were done with utmost care. And then there's the physical problem of how much can you reproduce and how close can you get. Massimo, who I call an alchemist of pixel and ink, knows a lot about perception and a lot about how reproduction works. And standard reproduction in a book is 4 colors: cyan or blue, magenta or a pinkish color, yellow, and black. And so those 4 colors are converted through a dot process to create mixes of colors. They're standard colors that everybody uses, so I can take a book from Japan to China to Italy to Germany, and they should all be the same. Well, Massimo has a process that he has figured out a way that he can increase the number of colors by about 20%. So the way he says it is, you can see about 3.5 million colors. Photography can capture about 3 million colors. Process through CMYK can reproduce about 300,000 colors. So you're already working at an extreme disadvantage. He can change that color space, especially in the reds and oranges, through this other process. But then there are other times you just can't get it. So what you can do in some cases like that, when it's really important, is you'd make another color that you print over the standard 4 colors. So here is, just go back for just a second. This is our church and the Dedalus in the Joyce sketchbook, and you can see these orange China marker things. They're actually, if you look at the page or you look in here, there's some that are just ink, there's some with ink and China marker, and there's some with pencil. So that orange is a China marker. So this is the page with just the CMYK waiting for the 5th color. So up in the upper left is the church. And so you can see that the orange is very, very pale because he just needed a little bit knowing what this other color would be. The 2 in the upper right have no China marker on them. So those are going to be the same way. So if you go to the next image, this is the color of the 5th color plate. So you can see all the China markers have that. So there we have the China marker on the church. And so then he overprints that, and you get something that is as close to the original as you can. So that's one reason we go to Trifolio. Other printers do this as well, but Massimo is really a master at drawings. He's super good at drawings. So he has an extreme sensitivity to the subtleties of them, and he also has invented a process that he can match exactly the paper color. Called paper tone, and that first was used on the Jasper Johns drawings catalog, and I'm sure he used it on this one as well. And so I see our paper conservator going, oh, my beating heart, because nobody pays attention to paper, and a lot of times the paper color shifts because you're trying to get the image, most importantly, and so the paper will go a little yellow or a little blue or a little green. So, but Massimo works very hard to get the exact color of the paper. So that's one reason it's so much fun to do.
Paper tone is really interesting because what it is, it's a binder of all of these pages that have little hole punches in them. So around each hole punch is a particular color which has the CMYK numbers. So you lay it over the drawing, and so you can see the color of the paper coming through the color that he can print. So it's amazing that he can get that close, and it's a totally proprietary system. And it was Massimo who suggested this 5th color.
Yeah.
He knew that he could do it and that it would make a huge difference, and it really did. Did he make you play the color game?
He always gets everybody to play the
color game. He has this game where it's also, he's got a great sense of humor, where he has he has 5 colors. And he makes you look at them. They're on little squares. He makes you look at them you get 30 seconds?
Something like that.
And then he covers them up, and it gives you a stack of like 10 tiles of a green, a blue, a yellow. And then you have to try and remember which one it is. And they're all very slightly different colors. And it's a way to train you to understand that nobody, even people who've worked on this, on doing this kind of thing and who know color, our minds play tricks on us. Even 30 seconds later. So usually the first color you get pretty close. And by the 5th one you don't. And he has a very cruel joke where then he tries to test people a week later. I didn't have to do that one.
Right. Your color memory. Olafur Eliasson did a piece called Your Color Memory. And part of it is based on that kind of thing. And so if somebody tells you, oh, I remember it was exactly that brown, don't believe it.
Exactly.
So yeah, and if you're interested in that, there's actually a page in the back of Volume 6 of the Jasper Johns catalog, Raisonné of Drawings, where it actually breaks down some of that. And there's a picture of the paper tone being held over, and it's like 1% yellow, 19% cyan, 6% blue, and 1% black. And it gave exactly the color. And then next to that is like it shifts. He has it so that it shifts like +1 of one color only. And so it sounds terribly geeky, and it is. But when you look at the picture in the back of the Johns book, you see like, okay, that's why you can color test to this book.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, if you think about it, paper on paper. Like, how do you differentiate it? Because also whatever paper you pick provides a color that is then coming through in the drawings. And so the paper we picked is a new kind of paper called Blocker, and it's incredibly opaque. It's a proprietary technology as well, German, I think. And we thought it was very important because then none of the images would bleed through. And so what you get to experience is the drawing itself without the text behind it. But it was definitely another suggestion from him, and he printed out huge sheets for me and sent them to my house, and I stood outside, this is COVID, with his New York production manager looking at them outside, and it really made a huge difference in the book.
It's also very thin, so this book would be thicker if you used another paper.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I think it's time for a few questions, if there are any in the audience.
Just raise your hand. Okay.
Sure. My question is about Massimo.
Massimo, does he have an apprentice? Who's going to replace magician when he goes?
Well, he actually is working on that. He has some young people, and in the picture with Katy, there's a young man who's been there about 2, maybe 3 years now, and he had hired 2 people around the same time, and he's working very carefully with them. Trifolio was founded by 3 people who started out at another printer. Massimo started there when he was 17. One of the men who left, who did all the pre-press and camera work and was a typesetting expert, his father was actually the letterpress printer. And so it's like in the family. So Massimo doesn't have a child who wants to do this, but he is bringing some people along. And so because it really is a kind of knowledge that's passed down. I mean, we go to a pizzeria sometime on Aldus Mantucci's Street, which is named for a typographer, because Verona has, and right behind the wall on that street, Mondadori used to have a giant printing plant that employed 5,000 people. So there are a lot of really good printers in Verona, but none like Massimo.
He is very special. And I did ask him at lunch one day, why are there so many printing presses here? And he talked about how Mondadori had kind of an educational system and many people left there. And there's a real an investment in training the next generation too. And they're great. I mean, I was there 10 years ago for the paintings and collages printing, and some of those folks were still there, but it was also the younger people apprenticing under them.
Another question? Josh?
Can I just... Here you go. Sure. Question for Joseph. When you're designing a book, how might you approach a catalog raisonné in a manner that would not be a regular kind of exhibition catalog? Or are there aspects of Motherwell's works particularly that inform the way that you design a book?
Well, I mean, a lot of it is a question of space and juxtaposition. So, I mean, it's a completely different kind of document, so it requires a different mindset. And again, every catalog raisonné is unique. I mean, there are often, in the Motherwell catalogs raisonné, there are often many pictures on many works on the same page, especially in the paintings catalog. So sometimes they'll have 3 across. Whereas with Jasper Johns, for a variety of reasons, part of it being a living artist, and also because we really wanted to focus in on those, everyone is a full page. So there's only one case where we actually ganged works together on that because it was a series. So that's a different kind of decision. But obviously, as Katy and Katie Homans, who designed this book, would work together and say, okay, if you look at the Mexican sketchbooks, they're not all the same size. So which one of these should be featured. And so those are decisions that are made along the way to show nuance, to show what might be more important, et cetera. And that's a dialogue that goes on all the time. Same thing with the exhibition catalog. You're working with, okay, what's the size of the book? That's a much smaller book. How do you feature it? What do you do? And how do you do close looking? Because ideally, you are able to see as much as possible.
A very good designer will work with you even when they're in their design file.
Right.
Katy Homans, who's a very experienced designer, but also has worked on a number of catalogs raisonné. I would say, I wish I had grouped those differently, and she'd make it happen. I mean, I think it is, again, that there's such an investment in these types of publications, both exhibition catalogs and catalogues raisonné, that working with a top-notch publisher and production manager and printer, they understand that this usually only happens once, and it's worth taking the time.
And they have different purposes. Like John's catalog raisonné, the same person did the paintings and sculpture and the drawings, just as in this case. Amanda Porter Gillespie, on the other hand, what's the purpose of it? There's an ad coming out in next month's Sotheby's, or actually this month's Sotheby's magazine that Porter designed for the Motherwell book that deals with a completely different situation. What am I going to do? It might be across from a $1.2 million watch, or it might be across from a $19 million painting. How do I get people's attention when they're looking at that? That's a completely different design question, yet he brought real aplomb to it, and it looks fantastic. It's just a question of what's the particular audience, what's the particular purpose, and what are your production values? Because not everything is printed at this price.
I have one last question for you, Katy. It's about, what have you learned about Motherwell the draftsman through this project? And again, I'm not talking about individual discoveries, but about more generally.
It's such an interesting question, having worked on Motherwell for 20 years. And a lot of people will ask, how can you work on a single artist for so long? And I think it's really a privilege to be able to do that, to get to know an artist so well. I never had the privilege of knowing Motherwell. But I think that what I learned here is that Motherwell's drawings for him are really a space of freedom. I think that they are for many artists, but for Motherwell particularly, he talks about coming up against painting blocks. And he always comes back to these small-scale, intimate works. They're a generative process for him. They're a space in which it's almost like he can be himself. There aren't the pressures of the monumental scale, but also the public. These are very intimate things. Many of the drawings came to the foundation when he passed. So many of them were there in the studio, and he would pull them out. When we saw that enormous mural for the National Gallery, he had some of the lyric suites from 1965 just sitting in the studio. He liked to pull out his works and have them as seed works, and almost always the seed works are drawings. And I found that really interesting and not something I had really framed before. I know that he talked about wanting to have his work with him. He lost an early work in a divorce, and he tried to repaint it so he would still have it with him. And I think that's, that shows kind of that obsession with the original idea. And he'll write, not for sale, because he found that a space where, he could find himself. And I would actually like to hear Joseph's thoughts, having worked on this catalog. You mentioned, knowing of Motherwell and being interested in his work early on. And what was it like for you working on this catalog?
Well, it was really easy because Katy and her team had done such a great job. But the other thing for me was really the close looking. because there's a drawing. I'll just take there's a drawing. I think it's on this wall that I looked at it early on when we're doing this, and I thought, well, that sort of looks like an elegy. And then working through the catalog, I was like, oh yeah, okay, it really is a variation on a variation on a variation on an elegy, and just this week, looking at the show, I realized that a print that I saw in 1976, which was called Galois Blue parentheses yellow with black square. In my mind's eye, when I was telling somebody about something the other night, I realized, oh my God, that black square makes it an open. And yet it's like the collage, right? So again, it's that crosstalk. So for me, and I can only imagine what it was like for you, finding things more and more. There's a shape in there that's in a painting that I saw at the Reina Sofia called Totemic Ancestor, and that shape is in here. I have a friend who's got a print, and there's somebody in town who's got a print with that shape in it. You know, I'd never knew where that shape came from. Now I know it's a lot of places, but I still don't know where it came from. So that's part of the joy of working with such a rich artist who's got so many, especially cross-references and variations.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Edouard, can we ask you that question?
Yeah. I'm still thinking about it.
Good answer.
No, what I realized actually as we were installing the show, and I told you earlier that I found that early on I realized that this practice as a draftsman is kind of porous, and often it's difficult to demarcate, I don't know if it's the right word, the drawings from the rest. And then I realized really with the exhibition, as we were installing, and as suddenly I was seeing together all these works that I'd seen at different moments when the pandemic allowed me to travel, and I realized that they were all inextricably linked, the drawings, but also with the rest of the oeuvre. And what you were saying about this, how one motif can jump from a collage to a drawing, or one aesthetic effect can jump from one type, one modality of drawing to another, is very striking. So that's my first realization, but I hope to have many more during the run of the exhibition. But I want to thank you, Katy, and thank you, Joseph. It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise and your experience, Joseph. And thank you all for joining us, and have a good evening.